It is to this confusion between motion and the space traversed that the paradoxes of the Eleatics are due, for the interval which separates two points is infinitely divisible, and if motion consisted of parts like those of the interval itself, the interval would never be crossed. But the truth is that each of Achilles' steps is a simple, indivisible act, and that after a given number of these acts, Achilles will have passed the tortoise. The mistake of the Eleatics arises from their identification of this series of acts, each of which is of a definite kind and indivisible, with the homogeneous space which underlies them. As this space can be divided and put together again according to any law whatever, they think they are justified in reconstructing Achilles' whole movement, not with Achilles' kind of step, but with the tortoise's kind. In place of Achilles pursuing the tortoise, they really put two tortoises, regulated by each other, two tortoises which agree to make the same kind of steps or simultaneous acts, so as never to catch one another. Why does Achilles outstrip the tortoise? Because each of Achilles' steps and each of the tortoise's steps are indivisible acts insofar as they are movements, and are different magnitudes insofar as they are space. So that addition will soon give a greater length for the space traversed by Achilles than is obtained by adding together the space traversed by the tortoise and the handicap with which it started. This is what Zeno leaves out of account when he reconstructs the movements of Achilles according to the same law as the movement of the tortoise, forgetting that space alone can be divided and put together again in any way we like, and thus confusing space with motion. Hence we do not think it necessary to admit, even after the acute and profound analysis of a contemporary thinker, that the meeting of the two moving bodies implies a discrepancy between real and imaginary action, between space in itself and indefinitely divisible space, between concrete time and abstract time. Why resort to a metaphysical hypothesis, however ingenious, of the nature of space, time, and motion, when immediate intuition shows us motion within duration and duration outside space? There is no need to assume a limit to the divisibility of concrete space. We can admit that it is infinitely divisible, provided that we make a distinction between the simultaneous positions of the two moving bodies, which are in fact in space, and their movements, which cannot occupy space, being duration rather than extent, quality and not quantity. To measure the velocity of a movement, as we shall see, it is simply to ascertain a simultaneity. To introduce this velocity into calculations is simply to use a convenient means of anticipating a simultaneity. Thus, mathematics confines itself to its own province as long as it is occupied with determining the simultaneous positions of Achilles and the tortoise at a given moment, or when it admits a priori that the two moving bodies meet at a point x, a meeting which is itself a simultaneity. But it goes beyond its province when it claims to reconstruct what takes place in the interval between two simultaneities, or rather it is inevitably led, even then, to consider simultaneities once more, fresh simultaneities, the indefinitely increasing number of which ought to be a warning that we cannot make movement out of immobilities, nor time out of space. In short, just as nothing will be found homogeneous in duration except a symbolical medium with no duration at all, namely space, in which simultaneities are set out in line, in the same way, no homogeneous element will be found in motion except that which at least belongs to it, the traversed space, which is motionless. Now, just for this reason, science cannot deal with time and motion except on condition of first eliminating the essential and qualitative element, of time, duration, and of motion, mobility. We may easily convince ourselves of this by examining the part played in astronomy and mechanics by considerations of time, motion, and velocity. Treatises on mechanics are careful to announce that they do not intend to define duration itself, but only the equality of two durations. Quote, "Two intervals of time are equal when two identical bodies, in identical conditions at the beginning of each of these intervals, and subject to the same actions and influences of every kind, have traversed the same space at the end of these intervals." End quote. In other words, we are to note the exact moment at which the motion begins, that is, the coincidence of an external change with one of our psychic states. We are to note the moment at which the motion ends, that is to say, another simultaneity. Finally, we are able to measure the space traversed, the only thing, in fact, which is really measurable. Hence, there is no question here of duration, but only of space and simultaneities. To announce that something will take place at the end of a time t is to declare that consciousness will note between now and then a number t of simultaneities of a certain kind. And we must not be led astray by the words "between now and then," for the interval of duration exists only for us and on account of the interpenetration of our conscious states. Outside ourselves we should find only space, and consequently nothing but simultaneities, of which we could not even say that they are objectively successive, since succession can only be thought through comparing the past with the present. That the interval of duration itself cannot be taken into account by science is proved by the fact that, if all the motions of the universe took place twice or thrice as quickly, there would be nothing to alter either in our formula or in the figures which are to be found in them. Consciousness would have been indefinable, and, as it were, qualitative impression of the change, but the change would not make itself felt outside consciousness, since the same number of simultaneities would go on taking place in space. We shall see, later on, that when the astronomer predicts, for instance, an eclipse, he does something of this kind. He shortens infinitely the intervals of duration, as these do not count for science, and thus perceives in a very short time, a few seconds at the most, a succession of simultaneities which may take up several centuries for their concrete consciousness, compelled to live through the intervals instead of merely counting their extremities.